Alright, let's talk a bit about the results of the recent tests I did on the gambeson and the studded leather armor. In case you haven't seen those two videos, I'll link them in the video description down below. I imagine some of you might have been a little surprised by some of the results, or a few things might have seemed a little contradictory. Like, for example, I tested these two here, the Shamshir and the Filipino Panabas, and both of them have a pretty strongly curved blade, so you would think that they may perform similarly, but the Shamshir did next to nothing against the gambeson, whereas this one here just tore right into it. And that seems a little odd in some ways, taken at face value. So I will discuss a little bit why I think that is, and also some of my intentions behind those tests. So first off, the whole thing was not intended as a demonstration of what would happen on a historical battlefield. For one, the gambeson isn't entirely historically accurate. So original ones, as far as I know, would have had more layers, different materials as well. So it is some form of padded armor, and it's still interesting to see what this kind of cloth, how much resistance it offers against blades, but it's not 100% accurate. If anybody has a historically accurate gambeson that they would consider selling or donating for armor tests, please let me know. And for example, if any of you are reenactors and you've made your own gambeson or akiton, and it's a lot closer to what they had back then, that would be very interesting. Or any other kinds of armor. If you have anything that you'd like to see me tested, please let me know. Send me a message on Facebook, ideally. But yeah, that just as a side note. So this is really more intended as a entertaining look at what happens if I take this and use it on that in such and such way. And as I keep doing these tests, I will get better at them. Meaning, for example, what I noticed is I should have offered a bit more information. There's always a difficult balance to strike between talking too much and not offering enough information. On the one hand, I don't want to make the video overly long. On the other hand, sometimes if you omit something, it gets confusing. For example, I should demonstrate the sharpness of the edge beforehand. And in case of the Shamshir, I was actually wrong as to what condition the edge currently is in. Because I sharpened it for the review, and I remember I brought it to shaving sharpness. I could literally take hair off my arm with the edge. But since then it dulled considerably. So I expected the edge retention to be better, but clearly it isn't. So right now, this is not very good. You can probably see how it just tears the paper. Those aren't terribly clean cuts. It's still fairly sharp, and I think most people would consider this sharp, sword sharp, whatever that means. But it's just not ideal for a blade like this. This is a relatively light blade, and because it is so strongly curved, it relies on this kind of slicing action. So this kind of edge needs to be very sharp. Now, different kinds of blades require different sharpness, and of course there's always the whole debate and argument as to how sharp does a historical sword need to be, or how sharp were they. There is some evidence in different directions, and in fact it's quite likely that different people prefer different kinds of edges, and also across different areas and in different time spans, and very much different blade types, depending on what you go up against as well. Is there armor, what type of armor, and so on and so forth. So this I will have to sharpen some more to get a better result. Now, to give you the direct comparison here, so here is the Filipino blade. It's pretty easy for you to see that this is a lot sharper, right? It doesn't tear the paper as much, and it's pretty effortless. Now, paper cutting is only one indicator, and it's not the full picture. So you can you can put a very fine edge on a blade like this, even one that can shave hair, but it may not be terribly effective against cloth, against several layers of cloth. Now, I still have to do some more tests to reach a conclusion, but I think overall you may actually be better off with a somewhat coarser edge. And this is something that I'm just going to talk briefly about. I should probably make an entire video about that at some point. Sharp isn't just sharp. There are many different types of sharp. If you ask knife collectors, for example, they among themselves disagree as to what an ideal edge is. And they will again have a different outlook to somebody who's talking about machetes, to somebody who's talking about axes, to swords, and so on. There are many different opinions and there are different ways of doing it. You can use a fairly rough grit stone or belt grinder or whatever, and bring a blade to a really sharp, fine edge, but it's going to be a lot rougher. So microscopically, it's going to be very uneven. So it's almost like micro serrations. Whereas some people like to hone and polish it with finer and finer stones, eventually even stropping it like a razor. So they get an extremely smooth edge. So far, personally, I've preferred a rather smooth edge also on my swords, because smooth edges tend to be more durable. However, that's just talking about the grit. There are other aspects as well, like the edge angle is very important, and the edge geometry. For example, if you have a full flat grind that is at a very acute angle, this is going to be a very sharp blade. And it's going to cut really nicely, but it's not going to be very durable or strong. So if you put such an edge that you would have on, well, the most extreme example would be a razor, where you have an extremely fine edge and a hollow ground blade that is incredibly sharp, but it would break and dull immediately if you used it on a weapon like a sword. And then there are apple seed grinds, which are shaped more like this, convex. They are a lot stronger. They can also be brought to a really high sharpness, but they're going to perform quite a bit differently, because this kind of shape is always going to offer a bit more resistance as it goes through the target. And that you combine with the shape of the blade and the weight of the blade, and then you get a whole variety of subtle but important differences. I gave the Shamshir a fairly smooth edge, but it looks and feels as if the Panabas has a somewhat toothier edge, so that may, at least in part, explain the differences in the result. But it may also have to do with the fact that the blade on the Panabas is curved forward in relation to the handle, even though it's also curved backward. It has this S shape, while the Shamshir is only curved backward. And finally, the Panabas is lighter, so it moves at greater velocity, which again can have quite a bit of an effect. About the target, I need to comment a little bit. So the setup with the dummy there, with Bob, it's not ideal. I like it in some ways because it is something shaped like a torso, and it's pretty stable overall. So it has some definite advantages over the other setups I've tried so far. But the drawback is it has more give, especially combined with padding. Now on a person, chest for example, there isn't actually that much material. I mean, it depends. If you have somebody with a massive chest, all them chest gains, then there's going to be more material, of course. But you still have the ribs right there, and of course the collarbone in particular I mentioned. There's just not much material. Even if you have somebody who is fairly muscular, they don't have any muscles covering the collarbone. So some bones are going to be mostly exposed. There's just going to be a layer of skin and a bit of subcutaneous fat. And so if you strike that, it's going to have a lot different results compared to striking, say, the abdominal muscles. The way the blades bounced off the padded armor, that might not happen the same way on a real person. I'm right now working at another setup for blade tests, which will also allow me to do thrusts. So we'll see how that goes. But in short, really, This is, you know, a discovery, if you will. So as I go along, as I do more and more tests, together with you, I discover, okay, how does this work? How does that work practically? And I'll be trying to improve the test as I go along, and I welcome any kind of constructive feedback, of course. So keep that in mind. That's really what this is about. Also, with regards to the strikes, I've realized that on some of the strikes, I've just executed them kind of half-heartedly. I just, okay, so a cut that's fine for tatami, for example, and other test mediums where you focus more on the technique, the edge alignment and such. And I'm in that kind of habit that I focus actually more on the technique and the edge alignment because that's what I want to improve. And I focus less on generating as much force as I think would be necessary. So again, over time I will try to focus on that more and deliver cuts the way I think I would in a fight. Like with the messer, for example, I did that, and it certainly had a different effect when I, put more intent into it, if you will. Apologies if this is a little rambly. I just like to give you my thought process as I go along, and I'd like to be natural about it. Because, well, you know my channel, that's what I do here, right? So the other thing I wanted to talk a little bit about was the difference between the two axes. So the tool axe actually performed a lot better than the fighting axe, which is ironic, of course. So there are, again, a few things to keep in mind. So for one, even if this consistently performed better than that in cutting and chopping and so on, which I don't think it will ultimately. But even if it did, there would still be the issue that this is the better weapon. This is for historical combat. This would just perform a lot better because for one, well, you have massively superior reach, and reach is quite important because it allows you to stay further away from the opponent and still threaten them. And if you have more reach than your opponent does, then they will have to put themselves at risk by entering your measure where you can attack them, which is still outside of their measure where they cannot strike you yet. So this is definitely an advantage in that regard. Also, vastly longer edge. So this means you have more to strike with. This requires more precision, and especially as the opponent is moving around and actively trying not to get hit, this makes it more difficult to have such a small area that is effective for striking as opposed to all of this. And one macabre detail is that an axe like this would be more likely to get stuck in the body of an opponent in a historical battle, whereas this is more likely to cut through. So that's mainly because of these angles here. You see that there's a sharp 90-degree angle. This here isn't quite 90 degrees, but it's still a pretty pronounced corner. So if that enters between the ribs, it can get lodged in there, get stuck between ribs, and then be difficult to extract. This one here can still get stuck with those horns here, but it's less likely because of how strongly curved it is. So this just wants to slice through and basically travel on and go through the body. So the other thing also, once again, is the edges. So this tool axe here actually has a better edge geometry. The way it tapers, I can't really show you in detail. I tried that before, but it always, you can't really see that properly on camera. But this one here is, again, a more acute angle. I'd also like to mention that the points on the Dane axe, or the horns, are curved away from the target, while the straight edge on the tool axe has these 90-degree angles basically pointing right at the target. The sharp corner may start tearing into the material, then the edge can pass through there more easily and can then start cutting into the material underneath after the tear has been started. So I'm assuming that that's what happened. Overall, I'd like to urge you to take everything you see with a grain of salt. Obviously not just my tests, but anything really you see in a video, and try not to jump to generalized conclusions immediately, because sometimes you just have insufficient information. The other thing at the end I want to show you is for one of the next tests I have planned is this. So I poured some ballistic gel over this wooden dowel here. This I've had lying around for a while, but if I remember correctly, this was hemlock, so it's not a hardwood, and this should be pretty interesting. It's about the size of a forearm. I mean, it doesn't taper, but you know, it's reasonably close. It's wrapped in plastic, both to keep it clean and also as a very rough skin substitute, some stretchy material. And this should be pretty interesting to try out. So I can put the one of the sleeves of the gambeson over it and see how that goes, or maybe try without as well. So again, if anybody has any armor lying around that you have no use for and that you'd like to donate for testing, please send me a message. I'll also post a link to my Facebook page down below. And otherwise, yeah, as I said, there will be more tests, plenty in fact, in the future. And I'll keep updating my interpretations and conclusions as I find out more. So yeah, that shall be enough for now. Thanks for watching. Have a good one.